Moving on then to our second topic within the English legal system, we're moving on to looking at the system of the courts, concentrating on the civil courts. And what I've done for you is split up the courts into the main or mainstream courts and also what I've said other courts, other rather more specialised courts. And there's four that we've got to look at here. There's the House of Lords, the Court of Appeal, the High Court and the County Court. As regards what the examiner could require you to know, the knowledge about these courts, three things. Let's identify this before we start on the detail. Firstly, he could require you to know the jurisdiction of the court. What he means there is what kind of case, what kind of law does the court deal with? So does the court deal with, say, the law of contract? Does it deal with employment law? Or does it deal with, say, company law? So that's the first thing, jurisdiction. The second thing that he could ask you about is the issue of appeal. Let's imagine that you've lost your case. Can you appeal to a higher court? And if so, where? And the third thing he might ask you is the constitution or composition of a particular court. By that, what the examiner means is if you went to a court, what type of judge would you find and how many of them deciding your case? So when we say composition or constitution, we really mean the personnel of the court. Well, those are the three things that the examiner could ask you about. But it has to be said that it's the first two that are of major importance. Jurisdiction and appeal. To a certain extent, composition or constitution is an add-on. So I'm going to be concentrating on the first two. Your notes, of course, cover all three. And I'm going to be introducing you to this, and I'm going to be looking at it by means of a diagram, so you can see how the courts fit together in the structure. You'll be needing to look at the detail yourselves in your own time. So let's start at the bottom of the structure of the main courts. We'll start with the County Court and the High Court, because this is where cases begin, and because of that we call them first instance courts. So if you wanted to sue somebody, you could bring your case in the County Court or you could bring your case in the High Court. In general, the smaller, less complicated claims will begin in the County Court, whereas the high value, more complicated claims will be in the High Court. As regards the county courts, every medium-sized area will have a county court, so there's a number of them around the country. And if you're looking at the jurisdiction, the detail, on the next page of your notes, you'll find that most of its time is taken up with contract and tort disputes, although it deals with other things like landlord and tenant, for example. So if you don't pay your rent and the landlord wants to sue you, he'll take you to a county court. If we're now looking at the High Court of Justice, commonly just called the High Court, for jurisdictional purposes, it has three divisions. Firstly, there is the family division. Its jurisdiction is largely matrimonial matters, divorce, for example. Family law isn't within your syllabus, so we're not very concerned with the family division. Then there's the Chancery division. In general, the Chancery division deals with all the rather more difficult areas of law. You'll find the lawyers with the best brains will be practicing in the Chancery division. Examples within your syllabus of its jurisdiction are partnership law and company law. We then turn to the biggest division, the Queen's Bench division. Biggest in the sense that it has the biggest volume of work. It's a very busy division. In essence, it's the dustbin division, in that if something isn't specifically allocated elsewhere, then it lands up in the Queen's Bench division. But for the purposes of your exam, the most important examples of its jurisdiction are contract and tort claims. Well, let's say you've had your case in the High Court in London as appropriate. Let's say then that you've had your case in London in the High Court or out in the country in one of the county courts. And you lose. Can you appeal? And the answer is yes, you can. You appeal to the next court up. That's to say, the Court of Appeal. Be careful there. Common error of students is to say that appeals from the county court always lie to the High Court of Justice. No, the general rule, appeals from the county court lie to the Court of Appeal. Similarly, that general rule also applies to the High Court. Appeals go to the Court of Appeal. Well, let's say you've got to the Court of Appeal and you lose. Can you appeal on further? Then the answer is yes, to the topmost court in the country, the House of Lords. Later on this year, that court will change its name, probably the back end of the year, to Supreme Court. Well, that's the normal route of appeal. But there is an oddity that we do need to make mention of. And that is to say that it is possible to appeal from the High Court direct to the House of Lords, missing out the Court of Appeal. That's called a leapfrog appeal, because you're jumping over the Court of Appeal. If you've ever played the children's game called Leapfrog, you'll know exactly why it's called that. Well, we said the High Court and the County Court were first instance courts, because that's where cases started off. The Court of Appeal and the House of Lords are for appeals only, and we would describe them as being appellate courts. And we would describe them as being appellate courts. So that's the main civil courts. Let's now factor in the other courts. Starting first with the magistrates' courts. Lots of magistrates' courts around the country. Every local area will have a magistrates' courts. Its main jurisdiction is criminal. We mentioned that earlier, trials of minor offences. But it does have a small but important civil jurisdiction, which is what we're looking at this stage. Under the Children's Act, it deals with things like council care orders. So if parents aren't looking after their children properly, the local authority, the local council, may wish to take that child into care to look after them. You can see why this is dealt with in the magistrates' court locally. It would be a nonsense for the council to have to go all the way up to London to the family division. Too slow, too expensive. It can be dealt with locally by the magistrates' court. Well, let's say that there's to be an appeal from the magistrates' court. This is where we get to a little bit of an oddity. In fact, the appeal lies to the High Court, more particularly the Family Division Divisional Court. So although we said earlier that the High Court is mainly first instance, here we've got a little appellate jurisdiction. Well, let's say that there is to be a further appeal. Where does that go to? And that is to the House of Lords. That is, by the way, direct to the House of Lords, but that is a normal route of appeal. It's not a leapfrog. Normally, as a rule of thumb, by the way, you have 3 court hearings, and here we've got our rule of thumb being obeyed. So that's having slotted the magistrates' courts into our hierarchy of courts. The next one to look at is the Employment Appeal Tribunal. Again, let's put this into the diagram to see where it fits in. Despite its name, tribunal, it is actually not a tribunal, it is a court. It's a court of the same status, actually, as the High Court of Justice. But from its name, it clearly is very specialised. It deals with employment matters, but also from its name, it's for appeals. So there must be something lower. So let's start lower with the employment tribunals. There's lots and lots of these employment tribunals dotted around the country. You should find one near you. The jurisdiction of the tribunals is between the employer and the employee, solely on employment matters, like, for example, unfair dismissal. So if you're an employee and you reckon you've been unfairly dismissed, you can sue your employer, and it must be in a local employment tribunal. We'll do much more on unfair dismissal when we get to the law of employment. Let's say then that you've had your case in the local employment tribunal. Can you appeal? And the answer is yes. You appeal to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, which, as we said, is a court of the same status as the High Court. So if you're going to appeal further, where would you reckon you appeal? Yeah, not to the High Court, because that's the same status. Your appeal actually is to the Court of Appeal, then as usual your final appeal within the country, off to the House of Lords if necessary. Well, we've now done the civil courts within the country. But there are 2 further civil courts we need to make mention of, which are on the mainland of Europe. They are the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Justice, this is the court of the European Union, so it deals with EU law. Now, as it happens, European Union law is not within your syllabus. So we don't consider the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, any further. You need to know it exists, and you need to know it is to do with the European Union. As regards the other court on the mainland of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, not, by the way, anything to do with the European Union. What it's to do with, as its name suggests, is human rights. Human rights, of course, is a topic within English legal system that we do at the end of this chapter. So it makes sense, actually, not to say anything more about the European Court of Human Rights at this stage, but to cover it when we do human rights. So that's completed our court system.